It's hard not to be impressed by the Insomniac Spider-Man games at a glance. They're incredible on a technical level. A Manhattan of this scale and visual quality is hard to find elsewhere, and now it's even more impressive at 60 FPS 4K on PS5 with the new Miles Morales game. Looking at this place, I almost feel ungrateful that overall I just find these games to be okay. To me, they're just fine. The new Miles Morales game may even be slightly better than the 2018 Peter Parker release. The new Venom combat moves spice things up, and a lot of the bloat has been cut for a much tighter experience. The graphics, the performance, the spectacle of the city, the admittedly decent variety of choices in battle, it makes for a fun experience, but it's not one I'm overall terribly engaged by. The combat gives you some nice toys, but the lack of traditional hitboxes means there's a strict delineation between which moves affect individuals and which affect multiple foes. This, besides feeling overly rigid, becomes more of an issue due to most multi-enemy attacks being less readily available, either having limited uses or being reliant on having access to objects in the environment. This means that a lot of the game's combat can devolve into a bit of a grind as you wail away on single enemies one at a time, plucked from a group. Whisking away one dance partner at a time to the Spider-Man attack animation dimension. The way attacks autocorrect to land on an enemy means positioning isn't as important as it could have been. Enemy variety is extremely low, which makes the combat feel repetitive even in this 8-hour campaign. I think too much of the overall combat system is dependent on expendable resources. Can't use Venom attacks without Venom meter. Can't use invisibility until it recharges, or your items have limited uses, etc. While this incentivizes staying in the fight to regain use of these abilities, I don't think enough is left over to use if you're out of all this stuff at a given moment. If that happens, you're relegated back down to just using punches, kicks, and grabs again. A harder game where Spidey has more of these abilities always available, I think would have made for something much more chaotic and engaging. Traversal through the environment has a nice feel to it, but it's simple and I think ultimately a bit unsatisfying. As you spend a lot of time in a giant open city, movement doesn't require being executed with much finesse or precision to beat the game. Stealth, once again, is basic and doesn't throw anything into the mix we haven't seen in stealth segments in games like this a million times before. Arkham Asylum's stealth was on a similar level of complexity to this game, released over a decade later. But I'm not really bitter about all this because I get why the game is the way it is. Fact is, the market doesn't want a linear, tightly designed action Spider-Man game with in-depth varied combat, tight platforming segments, or complex stealth. The fantasy people want to live out in their Spider-Man game is getting to roam around a huge open-world New York, and for that to be possible, the devs are probably not going to be able to make a game with the deepest combat in the world. A huge plethora of complex and confined platforming segments is going to be a little hard to pull off in a big open New York City where people expect your definitive Spider-Man game to be set. If the intent really is to make the definitive open-world Spider-Man, I still think there's more interesting ways to pull that off than what is done here. In terms of open-world gameplay, what is here is still pretty basic. You know, a big map with main mission markers, side mission markers, and collectible markers. I do wonder why we have to stick so rigidly to this formula in every open-world game. Especially when you play as Spider-Man and there's an opportunity to get really creative with it. How about a game where you're just let loose in Manhattan as Spider-Man with no markers? Maybe you come across an event and have no idea if it's going to lead to an intricate storyline with some major Spider-Man antagonist involved, or just a basic one-off crime you solve because it's intrinsically fun or rewarding. A game where you get to be sort of like Spider-Man or something. If the open world side of the game had that level of development and thought put into it, I'd probably be more satisfied with the fairly basic combat and traversal mechanics presented. What I probably wouldn't be able to overlook though, no matter what, is how bland the visuals of this game look on an artistic and aesthetics level. Again, this title just wants to be the definitive modern Spider-Man experience, and as a result, stylistically, it aims for a very basic, safe look, I think. In this case, I think it will age somewhat poorly once graphical technology takes another bound forward. The story is fine, kind of predictable, especially because this is a pre-existing brand where prior knowledge means you know certain things are coming. I think what is a real turn-off for me with these games is the overbearing, ever-present sentimentality. Not every conversation with a friend or loved one needs to include an impassioned display of affection, or wistful tones and expressions as characters remember a nostalgic moment. The main characters in this game are so overly earnest at all times in a way that I don't think real people are, at least not in my neck of the woods. I like stories where you have to read between the lines a little about how characters feel. This makes real, outward displays of earnestness and emotion at one or two points in the story hit much harder and feel earned. Having to use a bit of intuition about how people really feel, I think is more true to life. The dialogue itself is written well enough in the cutscenes, but the title tended to undermine itself a lot by dropping its most cringy material mid-gameplay, usually with some kind of joke that left me totally cold. If the game had just remained silent in those moments, I probably would have thought higher of it. It's funny because while I was playing Miles Morales for the first time, I went back to play Infamous Second Son again, which now plays amazing on PS5 at a locked 60 frames. And I gotta say, it was pretty wild how much more I was enjoying it in comparison to Miles. The dialogue felt supernatural, the banter was always popping off great between the characters, level traversal required a lot more skill and finesse to maximize your speed when crossing the game world, the visuals were stylistically much more interesting, the original soundtrack was much better, and while not super deep either, the combat remained at a much more constant, explosive, and chaotic level throughout. While I can see myself wanting to go back for even more playthroughs of Second Son in the future, I'm already at the point where I don't think I'll be playing Spider-Man 2018 again. I think what I said about that title remains the same with the Miles game. These Insomniac Spider-Man titles are impressive technical achievements now, but what is the spark that's going to have us returning to them once the next more technically impressive open-world New York Spider-Man game comes along? Because it won't be any kind of unique setting, or visual style, or the combat, or the stealth, or the traversal mechanics. It maybe sounds backhanded, but if you're interested at all in these games, then I guess I recommend playing them as soon as possible, before they're made obsolete by their potential follow-ups.